Good day, everyone. Hope you're all well at the comfort of your spaces. On these, like somber Easter holiday celebrations, I wish you a happy Easter. Yes, and today, there is this subject, that came up on my mind. While I was in a meditative state. The subject goes by "Do not succumb to social pressures." Yes, as you know it, we are on the 21st century, on the fifth, generation, of all things having to do with internet, on this age, it's difficult, finding, a loyal partner, yes, and I know a lot of people, younger people, they've opted, to stay single, some even to an extent, they've taken decisions to stay single for the life, yes, and and concerning that, I would like to tell you that opted to live single lives. I know you are having different reasons. I'm a person who advocates that you should be respected. As you are. Is everyone. Has a right, to lead, the life he or she wants, and with no judgment, or discrimination, and as you know it all, we are all having, will, we are all free moral agents, with the will, and as such, we should be respected, and you're not supposed to to succumb to social pressures, and also the norms and values of the societies, there are some societies who consider as something that is unseemly, to for a person, to get to a certain age without marriage, and you find that some of those, norms and values were instituted, by the people, who were ignorant, and now that you are in enlightened, generation, what you are doing, where we are going, and with such, no one is supposed to detect, on our decisions, and also, I'm not, advocating, for libertinism, no, I'm no way, encouraging that, and these are the reasons, you find that, of course, I'm well aware, as concerning women, I'm well aware, of, those, menopauses and stuff, but if a person has taken a decision, that decision has to be really respected, and with such, and the whole bottom point is this, that you're supposed to make, decisions, wholeheartedly, as with the, spiritually, and emotionally, and mentally, and physically also. You're supposed to be one. The whole of you is supposed to be one when you make a decision. With such, you're not supposed to be pressured, by anyone, into doing things. You find that those people, who are pressuring you, they don't tell you the whole process of the thing, e.g., the things that comes with, marriage, things that comes, with the with having, children, they don't tell you the whole thing, and you might find yourself, someone is pressured you into getting into a relationship, and there are things that goes with the relationship, and you find that, all those things, like they don't fit well with you, and you find that, like you've made a bad decision because of someone else who pressured you, and, you live with regrets or the whole of your life. If I can paint a picture right now, like you might find, someone pressures you, like into having kids, and you have kids, like two kids, and you find that, after that, you might find that, like there are a lot of things that goes with the, like with the child keeping, like having to change the nappies, like there are things, like a child gets sick, you have to be awoke the whole night, having to be at the hospital, and you find that, like you're not prepared for all of those things, and what I'm saying is, you have to be whole, when you take a decision, like making a decision, like deliberate, be deliberate, and yes, and yes, and like if, like there are circumstances, especially in life, like in nowadays, like these, like economical, like downturns, like things tend to be a little bit harder, like in life, like there are some such things, like to put into consideration, and these might be also the some of the things now that contribute, like to people not, like getting married and this and that, and yes, there are such things, and yes, and like with such, like you're not supposed to hurry into things, like of course, some, like they tend to be competitive, especially with their peers, that, oh, my peer, like my friend, or my classmate, like has bought a house, my friend has family, my friend is well established, my friend, like has, like car, and I'm behind, like you're not supposed to be in competition with anyone, like you're supposed to run your own race, if you find yourself, like competing with other people, like those are the things that put pressure, like on people, and we know, especially, like the unhealthy, like competitions, like it's all, like out of way, and what I'm saying is, you're not supposed to be in the rat race, and lead your own life. Lead your own life, and be deliberate, like in your decisions, and you're not supposed to be pressured by anyone, and that's it I wanted to share with you, like when time permits, I will also raise this subject again. Otherwise, I say thank you, family. God bless. Goodbye.